Welcome to the second video on cognitive developmental research. On the screen, you see a quote from a song by one of my favorite rock singers, Bonnie Raitt. Whether your sunglasses are on or off, you always see the world you make. This is the basic cognitive developmental researchers' findings, that each of us makes sense out of the world that we encounter in our own, partly unique ways. That we construct a world that we make sense of. And cognitive developmental research tries to trace the sequences, the tools, the processes that actually lead us to different ways of making sense out of the world in more and more sophisticated and adequate ways. Just a quick review. If you remember from the last video, Piaget believed that there were four stages, more or less discrete periods of time, linked to particular ages, that marked preferred tools for making sense out of the world. So that in the sensory motor stage, our preferred and sometimes only way of making sense out of the world is through direct contact with the world and through our senses. That schema, ways of making sense, concepts of the world developed in that way. With pre-operational stages, we come, said Piaget, to prefer language as a tool for organizing and conceiving of things in the world, and to make use of imagination to do that as well. Concrete operational thinkers, he believed, come to make sense in a preferred way out of the world through certain deliberate and very sensory-based operations, like classifying things, putting them into order in hierarchies, into reasoning about things generally in the world from the concrete, experienced situations that we find ourselves in. Finally, he believed that formal operational thinking, while not rejecting any of these other tools for making sense out of the world, gradually, in that stage, we come to prefer intellectual tools that are both abstract, that are hypothetical, that are self-conscious, that involve a systematic approach, and that allow us to reason from what is or what might be to what would have to follow. That is the scheme that we looked at last time. So today, I'd like to talk a bit more about these stages, what connects them and what distinguishes them. Here is this is going to be a little bit hard to look at. I think I'll probably give this to you as a handout. Let me still make this a little bigger. Here is a list of features of making sense out of the world that children in one stage are gradually able to supersede the abilities of kids in earlier stages. So, for instance, there are some things that, for instance, pre-operational, let's take this up from the top. That pre-operational thinkers in Piaget's and similar researchers' findings have trouble doing and making sense out of the world. Okay? For instance, there's a certain amount of egocentrism that remains from early childhood, these researchers found. In other words, they have a lot of trouble thinking about the way other people think about the world. Their theory of mind, so to speak, is not very well developed. So, if I tell a story about something that happened, I may not fill in all the blanks that would enable someone else to actually see the whole picture of my story. I assume that's because I remember everything, they must remember everything as well, even if they weren't there. That's egocentrism. Later on, we're going to talk about formal operational thinkers, kind of adolescent, as it were, egocentrism, which is of a different sort. Whereas concrete operational thinkers have less trouble and increasing less trouble in making sense out of the way other people think about the world, and the way other people think about them, and the way they think about themselves. It gets pretty sophisticated. Notoriously, young children, toddlers, and even up to kindergartners have, for instance, imaginary friends. They imagine themselves as being characters out of a story. They think there are monsters under the bed. Well, there really are monsters. No, that's not true. I've discovered that there aren't monsters, they're just dust. But kids of that age really do believe it, so we have to go check. So there's this confusion between physical and psychological events. That gets largely, but not entirely, superseded with concrete operational thinking. One of the abilities that your book focuses on, and was the subject of one of the e-text videos that I asked you to look at, is the difference between pre-operational thinkers' inability to conserve in certain ways, to see that things that change are actually still the same in other ways, and concrete operational thinkers' abilities to do so. So when you looked at that video, you saw, for instance, that when a 5 or 6 year old child looked at 2 rows of coins and counted them and answered, are the rows the same, with the affirmative, that they changed their minds when you physically stretched out one of the rows. Even though they had just counted them, the 5 and 6 year old seems to have a lessened ability to maintain the similarity of what had now changed, to see it as conserved, as saved, essentially. But 7-year-old, Piaget found, had less trouble. And in many instances, as in the video that you watched, could say, no, it's the same amount. So it's this, even if you change the physical appearance of it, it's still the same amount. And that makes perfectly good sense to them. That's one reason that Piaget made this marker between one stage and another stage, one box and another box. Okay, and this is the way his research actually progressed. Similarly, there are a number of ways in which Piaget and his followers in research distinguished the typical concrete operational thinker from the formal operational thinker. For one that I've mentioned before, concrete operational thinkers, and he thought 7 to 11-year-olds were these, have a lot of trouble reasoning from and to abstract concepts. That they're good at figuring out how to generalize things or figure out what comes next when they're dealing with concrete experiences, things that they can actually reach out and touch. So a child has difficulty with the concept of negative numbers. It's an abstract concept. How can something be less than nothing? But a formal operational thinker can conceptualize that and reason from it. There's a very famous experiment that was done with, I think, 8-year-olds and 16-year-olds, where they were presented with the materials that would make a pendulum. And they were asked, what makes the difference in the speed on which the pendulum goes back and forth? The group of 8-year-olds latched onto one good possibility, and they stuck with it. right? This is it, and I'm sticking to my story. They didn't go any further. The 16-year-olds together followed out all of the possibilities they could think of that made a difference and tested them one after the other. They were more systematic in their thinking. And it was these kinds of distinctions, the inability of kids at one age and the ability of kids of an older age to do something, to use an intellectual process or tool, that led the cognitive developmental researchers to make distinctions between stages. The question for us today, primarily, is how we can take advantage of the findings of this research to teach effectively, to help kids to learn. What I want to do is very briefly make some suggestions in that area. Okay. Give me just a moment while I organize my carefully organized files here, which ought to take me just a couple seconds. Here we go. All right. The first question is, how might you teach effectively to the child who primarily is pre-operational in the way that he or she makes sense out of the world? So we're talking about preschool kids. They come to us at usually age 3 or 4. Piaget believed that this stage of making sense of the world lasted to about 6 or 7. The researchers in this area make several suggestions that I think make some good sense. So for instance, first, use concrete props and visual aids whenever possible. These kids are absolutely concrete. Pre-operational kids, even concrete operational kids, have more or less difficulty in handling abstract, non-physical, non-sensory kinds of concepts. So if you talk about part and whole or half, give them something physical to manipulate. If they want to count things in the world, let them use concrete things to count. Secondly, make your instructions relatively short and make them physical. Demonstrate. Take kids through things for examples and for practice. And don't strain the amount of time that kids can focus on any one task. You know, in class we talked about a 40-45 minute maximum for focusing on a task for an adult. But for a preschool child, we may be talking about no more than 10 to 15 minutes on a given task as optimal if you want the best learning to take place. Don't expect students to be consistent in their ability to see the world from someone else's point of view. They may have very special and individualized conceptions of the world. Don't talk about things that are outside of their experience. You know what, I found that very often that's even the case for freshmen in high school. When I used to teach high school, I found that kids connected with things when you used examples that were local much more readily than if you tried to use analogies with things that were national or international in scope. It takes a while for this ability to develop. Don't worry too much about sharing. Yeah, I know Barbara Fulgham says in Everything I Need to Know I Learned About Kindergarten that you learn to share. Yes, you do, but don't push it. Yeah, kids are not bad morally at 2 or 3 or 4 because they don't like to share. They're simply looking at the world in terms of their own interests because that's pretty much what they're on top of. More. Be sensitive to the possibility that students may have different meanings for the same word or different words for the same meaning. This is the period in which gradually kids begin to master language, both words and grammar. In fact, there are explosions of increase in kids' abilities to make use of vocabulary and grammatical structures. But don't push it, because a lot of that language comes out of their personal experience and out of their egocentrism. They may get used to using a word or a phrase in one way that's very specific to their own experience or to their families. So don't suppose that when you use that same term in your teaching that they're going to understand what you understand by it. Take time to make sure that they're on the same page with you. Looking at nap or rest may be something very different than what you have in mind. Give children a great deal of hands-on practice with the skills that serve as building blocks for more complex skills like reading comprehension. Reading comprehension comes out of experience with language in many different settings. Give them lots of stuff to have experiences with, lots of hands-on things. Finally, just give them lots of experience. You know, the Montessori approach to education is especially effective at this age, where you focus on shapes and colors and sizes, on actions and reactions, on very basic kinds of experiential kinds of experiences. Help them to get language to describe all of this. Help them to get a lot of sensory contact with the world around them and base what you teach and have them learn around those sensory experiences. That's important. On the other hand, teaching the concrete operational thinker takes us into a different domain. Keep in mind that we're talking about an arc of development here and not actual boxes. Still, these distinctions are valuable. Educators who are steeped in this research make several suggestions for the concrete operational thinker. First of all, don't stop doing what you were doing before. Don't stop the emphasis on things that are concrete, that are visual, that are in all ways sensory, because we never lose our ability to learn through sensory routes. They just get gradually superseded by other favorite ways of making sense. Continue to give students a chance to manipulate and test. Concrete operational thinkers are more sophisticated in the language that they use, in the categories that they use about the world, the way they organize things, but they still use the concrete as the basis for all of those distinctions and generalizations. So when you set up science experiments, let them get the hands-on. Well, keep them off the flame, but hands-on in the experiment. Let them see what happens. Let them smell it. Let them see it. Well, I apologize, folks. This third video was really meant to be the finish of the second one. Unfortunately, my SD card on the camera I was using filled up right in the middle of the presentation. So on an iPhone 6, we're trying to finish it up. This won't take long, but I do want to finish what we started in talking about what educators have recommended as broad approaches to making use of Piaget's research in helping kids to learn more effectively. So when we left off, let's go to the screen. When we left off, what we were talking about are ways that you can work with concrete operational thinkers. That is, kids around 7 to 11 or so, who show a lot of the characteristics of being able to classify well, to hierarchy and sequence well, to be able to use inductive inference, going from individual instances to generalities. What can you do to help them to learn better? here are some of their recommendations. And forgive me if we're going over some of the stuff that was on the last video. Don't forget that kids are still sensory learners. So you continue to use concrete props, visual aids. The more sophisticated the material, the more complex, the more important it is to keep concrete and keep sensory. Timelines, diagrams, manipulatives, right, and so forth. Also, make sure presentations and readings are brief and well organized. Kids at this age can, generally speaking, handle a given task for 20 to 25 minutes or so without a break. But make sure you give them those breaks. Finally, use familiar examples, things that they're close to, not finally, to help them. Kids are able to manipulate and make sense of what it is that's local, that's part of their lives, much more readily than they can with things that are apart from their lives, which border on the abstract. Okay. So compare students' lives with those of characters in a story. Test the concept of area by having kids measure a room that they're familiar with. Give kids opportunities to classify, to group on an increasingly complex level. By the time they're 10 or 11, they're quite sophisticated in their ability to make sense of material by organizing. So give them slips of paper and ask them to group them into paragraphs. Right? Compare human body systems to systems in other areas that they know about. Computers, boy do they know about computers, and so forth. Those are some principles of dealing with concrete operational thinkers. There's one more area to talk about. Let's go back to the screen. When you're dealing with formal operational thinkers, or kids who in at least some part of their intellectual lives are preferring and using well the tools of formal operations, then here are some principles to go by in teaching them effectively. Don't forget the other kinds of tools. Still use sensory learning. Use the tools of language and then of classification. But also, give them the opportunity to try out their new tools. Let them deal with hypotheticals, the what-ifs. Right? Suppose we stop universal suffrage. What would happen to our democracy? Or suppose the South had won the Civil War. Well, how would things be different in the United States after that? Or suppose the character in this book had acted in another way in this scene. What might have been the progression of the story? All those kinds of things, formal operational thinkers can handle a lot better and increasingly well. Give them a chance to be systematic in solving problems, because the ability to think about all of the angles of a problem is one that formal operational thinkers have the ability to do. If they have the ability, then the kinds of practice and instruction that they get determines how far along the lines that they get. That's what we talked about in class on Thursday. We talked about reaction range. Once kids are developmentally ready, how much practice, how much instruction, how much interest makes the difference in where they end up. Whenever possible, teach broad concepts and not just facts. The more practice kids who can be formal operational thinkers get in dealing with abstract concepts, concepts that are not immediately sensed, the better they'll be able to manipulate those concepts, to compare them, to contrast them, and to see them in operation. If you're talking about history, introduce some of the historical concepts that are not simply facts about the world. If you're talking about science or music or literature, introduce concepts that are ones that they have to manipulate mentally. They'll know it when they see it, but they can't touch it. So these are some of the factors in general that make it possible for you to teach kids well, making use of cognitive developmental research. Add to the questions that I introduced at the end of video 1 this question: what specifically would you want to do in your classes to teach from the point of view of where kids are on cognitive development? Given Piaget's research, what are some specific activities that you would think would be effective in helping kids to learn? Okay, thanks very much, and we'll see you in class next week. Have a good week.